Good morning, everyone. It's Craig Studnicky from ISG World and Related ISG. Today's Thursday, January 23rd, 2025. So let me be one of the first of this week anyway to wish all of you a belated Happy New Year. And what a new year it should be. If you think about it, we have climbed through the first half of the 2020s. Yeah, we're halfway through this decade. 2020, 2021, 2022, 2023, and 2024. It's been quite a ride for every realtor here in South Florida and for a lot of realtors even throughout the United States. We're going to go through all of that and some more as we recap 2024, and I guess more particularly the first half of the 2020s. So here we go. And today we're starting with new construction. Change the order around a little bit because I am getting a ton of questions about the new construction since there is such tightness. You might even call it supply shock still in MLS. There's just not that much to sell for us. And we'll touch on that in 1 second. But let's start with new construction. Pre-construction projects have grown throughout South Florida. This includes primarily Miami-Dade, Fort Lauderdale, Broward counties. There are now 121 buildings, totaling over 25,000 condos in development since 2020. 84 of those, as you can see on this chart, are what we call traditional condos. Those would be condos with rental restrictions. Then there's the short-term rentals, which you see in that blue color. There are 37 of those, 12,775. We actually have more short-term rentals under development than we have traditional condos in South Florida. I touch on this in almost every Miami report because I can assure you we have all the short-term rentals we will ever need in South Florida. Now, for those of us that cherish Miami's future, we're probably always hearing the echo of the words of our Mayor Francis Suarez, who has said to me repeatedly how concerned he is that Miami may actually become a victim of its own success. And by that, what he means is we become one of the most popular real estate markets in the United States, if not the most popular. But inventory is getting tight, and developers' ability to build fast has been hampered by a combination of two factors. One was inflation and what it did to construction costs. And number two, the high cost of borrowing, interest rates, which need to go down a little bit further. So we're not building as fast as we'd like. However, what I'd love to see for the second half of this decade, to all the developers that are watching this presentation, a little more focus on the traditional condos. You know, the kind of condos where you can raise a family. That's what we need as the population of South Florida continues to grow. And ladies and gentlemen, it's continuing to grow. We did this is one of my favorite slides. I have a colleague that works with me. Her name is Esther Jimenez, and I call this my Esther Jimenez slide. But it always gives us back perspective of what we've been through in the last 30 years. 30 years ago, in the 2000s, we built almost 60,000 units. Call it 59,000. They all got sold. Everyone lives in them. Everyone lived happily ever after. But I can assure you that's way too much inventory. In the last cycle, which began in 2012 and ended in 2019, we built 19,400. And as I think I've said before, when you study the population gains of South Florida, that's exactly the amount of new condos, traditional condos that with rental restrictions, that need to get built just to accommodate the population growth of South Florida. Forget investors. Forget second home vacation sales. We're just talking about the net population growth of people that call Florida their new home. 19,000. In this cycle, which began in, well, really 2021, because nothing really got started in 2020 for reasons we all understand. There are now a total of 12,600 traditional condos in development. We're getting closer to that 19,000 number. However, if you look above that chart, under construction, 21 buildings, 4,152. That's the actual number of units in pre-construction. Again, traditional condos that are under construction. The other 8,000 and change are waiting for a groundbreaking. They're mostly waiting now for interest rates to drop. Construction costs have pretty much plateaued. Most developers and general contractors have an idea of where glass, steel, and concrete are going into 2025. You know, that's not the issue. Insurance, heck, that's tripled in the last 4 or 5 years. It's not nice, but they've got their heads and their arms wrapped around that too. No, it's interest rates. A lot of developers are still waiting for interest rates to drop to make the affordability of actually building these buildings a little more attractive. I think you're going to see a lot of groundbreakings this year. And whatever doesn't break ground this year will break ground next. But the sobering fact of this slide. If there's only 4,152 units that are under construction, folks, that's all that's going to get delivered in between now and the end of this decade, between now and the next 5 years. That's not nearly enough inventory that we need to manufacture to accommodate the population growth. Are there solutions to this? I think so. Let me show you. We did a little more of a deep dive into that pre-construction. There are a total of 84 traditional condos that are in development. We just talked about a few of them, 4,100 or so of the actual units, or 21 of those 84 buildings are actually under construction. But from a price standpoint, a lot of you asked me about this, so I did it for you. 9 of the 84 buildings are priced from $500,000 to $1.5 million. 75 of the 84, or the rest, are priced from $1.5 million up to $70 million plus. We call those high end. Not saying they're not selling well. I'm saying that when you look at what we actually need to satisfy the population growth of South Florida, we might have gotten a little too heavy on the high end condos, because what we really need are the others. Please don't misunderstand me. Those 75 high end condo buildings will get built. And in 5 years from now, 6 years from now, 7 years from now, the Miami skyline is going to be the envy of the world, because these buildings are, in fact, spectacular looking. It's just going to take a little longer than I think most people expect for these buildings to finish. But then there's this affordability issue that pops up all the time. Let me go deeper with that with you for a minute. We looked at all of the condos that sold in Dade County, Broward County, and Palm Beach County last year, 2024, and the year before, 2023. So we have a 2-year statistical base to draw some conclusions. And here they are. 85% of most of the condos that were traded between a buyer and a seller were east of Interstate 95, less than 10 years old, and priced from $500,000 to $1.5 million. East of Interstate 95, less than 10 years old, and priced from $500,000 to $1.5 million. 85%, 15% were from $1.5 million and up. So 15% were the high-end buyers. 85% was the typical American family, some Latin families, that have decided to call Florida their permanent home. That's an indication of affordability. So how much of that inventory do we have? Before I go there, I think that the $500,000 to $1.5 million, I think you'll see that bar go up to $2 million in 2025. I just don't think it's going to go much past that. Not for the typical person, the typical family that's moving here to South Florida. They want to be in properties that are less than 10 years old because of those new milestone laws that have been imposed on most of the older condos, the 30, 40, 50-year-old condos, all because of what happened to Champlain Towers over 3 years ago. That the state of Florida has created these milestone laws, which we'll talk about, making these 30, 40, 50-year-old condos very difficult to sell. Most mortgage lenders don't want to touch them. They're still putting together their final structural engineering studies to determine what kind of or how much of a special assessment is going to be assessed to most of the unit owners in those buildings. As a result of that, they're not real popular. Most people are asking for condos that are less than 30, in fact, less than 10. So how much of that inventory do we have for sale going into 2025? Well, let's start with MLS. Well, we have this is actually kind of an interesting story. You might even call it a tale of two cities. If you look at the upper right-hand corner, 22,000, that's the number of the typical amount of condos that were always for sale in the last decade, the decade before. 22,000, Dade County, Broward County, Palm Beach County combined. That's the kind of inventory that creates a level playing field. It's not a buyer's advantage. It's not a seller's advantage. It's actually a fair contest. And if you can see this trend from Q4 of 21 right through Q4 of last year, we're getting very close to that beautiful number that levels the playing field until you age the inventory, which is what we've done for you. This next slide does bring back into light the mandatory reserve requirement law, these milestone laws that have been imposed by the state of Florida on all condominiums in the state of Florida, 3 stories and above. the state of Florida, not just South Florida. The structural engineering reports were due on December 31st. Some of you have asked, hey, Craig, are there any buildings that are 30, 40 years old that you would recommend? Not right now because the reports aren't in. We have some idea of what some of the special assessments have been on some of the buildings, but not all of them. We'll probably be a lot smarter by the end of March. But as of right now, they're not real attractive either for buyers that are moving here or the mortgage lenders that are interested in lending. This shows the amount of inventory that is actually then really and truly for sale. Over 17,000 of those nearly 20,000 units in MLS are over 30 years of age. That inventory just keeps growing every single month in MLS because the people that own those units want to get out. Problem is right now there's nobody who wants to buy them. And if there are a few people that want to buy them, there's certainly no mortgage lenders that want to lend. So that inventory is almost useless for us at the moment, but that is the number. What's available that's under 30 years of age is 2,720. That's Dade, Broward, Palm Beach County combined. Please don't lose the perspective. What we should have is close to 20 to 22,000 of those units. No, you have around 2,700. So when it comes to condos, you are in absolutely a seller's market. And that's part of the reason why that inventory increased in value last year, an average of 10%. Yeah, 10% was the uptick last year on all condos less than 30 years of age. But remember earlier, I said that when we looked at the actual resale activity for the last 2 years, 2024 and 2023, most people were interested in buying condos east of 95. And that's understandable because you're close to the ocean, you're close to the intracoastal, you're close to the bay, the views get a lot nicer. And there's a lot of activity east of Interstate 95 from a lifestyle perspective. The other criteria is they wanted something less than 10 years old. They didn't want to buy a condominium that had any potential for structural problems. Maybe they needed an interior decorator, but certainly no structural engineers. So we asked and we looked, what's available there? Well, here's where we have an issue. Here's where you absolutely have supply shock. Again, between 500,000 and 1.5 million, where 85% of the sales are, east of 95, less than 10 years old. There are a total in the Tri-County area of 121 condos, and they're all in Miami. 0 in Broward County, Fort Lauderdale. 0 in Palm Beach County, Palm Beach. 0 inventory for sale, less than 10 years old, east of 95, priced from 500,000 to 1.5 million. Yeah, this is indeed supply shock for those families that continue to move to South Florida, and they're moving. We'll talk about that in a second. That criteria no longer exists. The amount of people that have moved here in the last 2 years, they've absorbed all of it, which is part of the reason I'm pretty convinced that inventory, when it does become available, will not be sold from 500,000 to 1.5. I think it's going to hit a new bar closer to 2 million this year. There is a solution to this. Condo conversions. There are a couple of media articles that have jumped on this. The Real Deal wrote a story back in June of this year. Bloomberg wrote a story just a couple of months ago in November, talking about the tightness of inventory between 500,000, and 1.5 million, where 80 to 85% of our buyers are actually trading when it comes to condos. They've also noticed that there are close to 60,000 multifamily, brand new multifamily units, rental buildings in development, mostly in Miami-Dade, Fort Lauderdale, Broward. That's a lot of inventory. We'll talk about those numbers in a minute. But what developers have seen is that the rents that they forecasted back in 2020, 2021, 2022, when they were writing their business plans for these multifamilies, have dropped anywhere from 10 to 20%, in part because there's a lot of inventory out there. Here's what I'm talking about. There are almost 35,000 multifamily units between Dade and Broward County that are under construction. About 24,000 have already been delivered, mostly in the last couple of years, totaling 60,000 units. Folks, that's a lot of inventory. Our population is growing nicely. Yes, we'll talk about that in a minute, but that's an awful lot of inventory. And that inventory coming online has caused some of the rental amounts to drop, depending on which neighborhood you are, anywhere from 10 to 20%. So the reduction in the rents is causing some multifamily developers to look for a different exit scenario. I really see this as such a win-win. We're running out of that inventory that's less than 10 years old, that's east of 95, and a very comfortable, affordable price range for most of the families that are moving here. The developers that are building these multifamilies are getting very nervous about the slight reduction, adjustment, if you will, in the rental amounts since the last 3-4 years. So the condo conversion, See, that could be a beautiful win-win for the buyers that are moving here, for the developers that are wondering what to do with these multifamilies that aren't penciling out like they used to, and for the real estate brokers, it's an immediate commission. Yeah, this could be the win-win. My company alone is selling 3 condominium conversions in Broward County at the moment. One is in Hollywood, one is in Dania, one is in Pompano. There will be others. There will be others. And I hope there are, because this is the inventory that we need to meet the expectation of the typical family that's relocating to South Florida. Let's go to demand. Many of you, I noticed, posted this article on your Instagram accounts in November and December. The Florida population surges to 23 million, driven by a migration boom. Two questions that popped in my mind. Number one, I wonder why they're not trending this, because the number by itself doesn't mean anything. What is 23.3 million compared to last year, compared to 5 years ago, compared to 10 years ago? I'm here to help you with that. But I had another question. Wonder why everyone's posting this. I wonder why most realtors are posting this story over and over and over again. In talking to a lot of you, I've come to the conclusion that you started to doubt the demand curve of this side. I think we all pretty much have a handle on supply. A lot of you tell me who watch the Miami reports every quarter have an excellent handle on where we are with supply, with new development as well as MLS. But we get a little lost in the weeds sometimes, I guess, when it comes to demand. Plus, I think you had a tough year last year, between that buyer representation agreement, which became effective in August, which I still think was a completely unnecessary disruptor for this business of ours, combined with the fact that mortgage rates popped, combined with the fact that we had a general election, a presidential election in November. Was it going to be Mr. Trump, or was it going to be Mrs. Harris that would occupy the White House in 2025? We didn't know, and it kind of slowed everything down. And I think the conclusion a lot of in your hearts and in your brains was the big question: is demand still there? Let me give you context. In the last 10 years, the state of Florida has been growing at an average between 950 to 1,000 people a day. But last year, and by the way, it's always a contest between Florida and Texas. Texas usually wins. They usually outpace us by about 5 to 10% of the daily population growth of Florida. But it's either Texas or Florida, Texas. They're the big two. 3, 4, and 5 almost don't even matter. And by the way, as a point of perspective, the land mass of Texas is 4 times Florida. So if 1,000 people a day move to Florida, we feel it here in South Florida, on the highways and byways and everywhere we go. 1,000 people a day move to Texas, it's a big place, and they just keep expanding because they can go as horizontal as they like. We have a little bit of an issue here in South Florida, don't we? We have the Atlantic Ocean to the east. We have the Everglades to the west. The only way we're going to accommodate future growth is vertical up. And that's why we have 84 condominium properties, traditional condos in development. There will be more because we're going to need more. But look at what happened last year. While all of you were wondering about demand, demand took care of itself. State of Florida last year grew by 1,280 people per day per the U.S. Census Bureau. Again, that's the Census Bureau measuring people that move into a state. They subtract people moving out of a state, and that's what tax returns and driver's licenses. Then they add births, and then they subtract deaths, and that equals X. And X are the amount of people they call Florida home, residents of Florida. It doesn't include investor sales. It doesn't include second or vacation homes. And given our beautiful weather, that's pretty much worldwide. So that number, 1,280, is an historic high for the state of Florida. Last year was 1,000. When we beat Texas, it was the year 2022 when we were almost at 1,100 people a day. I think that year Texas was 1,000 a day. Now this year we're 1,280. By the way, Texas is close to 1,500 a day, so they nudged us again. But still, 1,280 a day, historic high for South Florida. Not just South Florida, but the entire state of Florida, while we're moving into tight inventory. We're moving in a little bit into that concern of Mayor Francis Suarez. See, nobody lives in a short-term rental. People live in traditional condos with rental restrictions. We need more of that inventory because you're in momentum, folks, on this population gain. 80% of this minimum are Americans that are moving to Florida for a bunch of reasons, which we'll talk about again in another minute. Let's move to pricing forecasts. At the end of Q3, I was so excited because it looked like Trump was going to win. And it looked like for the first time you had Jerome Powell, the chairman of the U.S. Fed, and hopefully then the incoming president of the United States, both aligned, both in agreement that short-term rates and long-term rates, like mortgage rates, are coming down in 2025. Ironically, Donald Trump gets elected in early November when mortgage rates were hovering around 6.1%, 30-year fix for most Americans. And today it's 7.1. So yes, mortgage rates went up a full 1% since Donald Trump got elected. So that caused a little bit of a revision on where mortgages will be by this summer with Mortgage Bankers Association, Fannie Mae, and Wells Fargo, who I like to use when I'm doing my own forecasts. So folks, this is the revised forecast from Fannie Mae, Wells Fargo, and Mortgage Bankers Association. Basically, by the end of Q2, early Q3, they see us from the low sixes to the mid sixes. I think we all have to get our heads wrapped around that reality. That you're not going to see, I don't think you're going to see mortgage rates by this summer below 6%. So let's accept it as the new normal. And by the way, the mortgage payment difference between 5.9 and 6.5 isn't really all that. And when you consider how tight inventory is here in South Florida, combined with the population surge that we're continuing to see, I don't want to sound cavalier about it, but I just don't think it's going to matter. I think people are going to buy anyway. I think you can expect mortgage rates to soften, not as aggressively as we thought in Q3, based on representations from lots of other people. But I do very much rely on these three institutions. They're very reliable when it comes to forecasting. Anybody, I will tell you, though, that does tell you with certainty where mortgage rates will be by next summer, by the end of this year, 2025, walk away. Because there's just so many variables that can affect this that nobody really knows with any certainty. But these three institutions are an excellent guide. So let me conclude this Miami report kind of the way I began. Welcome to the second half of the 2020s. Yes, you are now past the first 5 years of 2020. And I thought I would offer you a little bit of a recap of what we've all gone through. 2020 started with, of course, the announcement of COVID, combined with Governor DeSantis ordering a statewide lockdown of everything. Well, clearly, none of us were ever in that chartered territory before. A complete shutdown, viruses, PPP money, Small Business Administration money, the economy. If we start this decade with that kind of a year, the following year, in reaction to this pandemic, Chairman Powell of the U.S. Fed lowered interest rates, the Fed overnight rate, to zero, an historic low to keep us from slipping into an economic recession, perhaps even an economic depression. So that was good news. Mortgage rates hit an all-time low in 2021. And by summer, unfortunately, we got hit with the bad news about Surfside, Champlain Towers, which absolutely has affected our lives because anybody that's trading real estate here in South Florida is having an issue selling 30, 40, 50-year-old buildings because of the special assessment issues now that they're dealing with because of that unfortunate tragedy. 2022, the new mandatory regulations as a result of Surfside came into existence. Now we knew that special assessments were coming, and that's the year it deeply affected our ability to sell those older condos, combined with the fact that mortgage rates were starting to go the wrong way from a realtor perspective. They were going up. In 2023, sure enough, we hit a 22-year high with mortgage rates, and they weren't finished. They went up even a little bit more last year. And last year, well, one of the articles we all had to deal with was the Wall Street Journal that wrote that story that the Great Florida Migration has come undone. Well, I just walked you through how that's not true. I don't know what it is about the New York media. They're constantly giving Florida and South Florida the business. Why? It's anyone's guess why. But they were wrong. The Great Florida Migration hasn't become undone. We hit an all-time high last year at almost 1,400 people a day. But finally, the question about who's going to be the next president of the United States was solved in early November. It is President Donald Trump. So we've got that kind of clarity. You know, when you look at what we've climbed through in the last 5 years, you probably feel as if you need a nap. It's a lot. In my 45-year real estate career, I've never been on such an emotional roller coaster, and nor have you. I mean, in the middle of all this was also the buyer representation agreement that we had to deal with, which affected our ability to sell general real estate. And it has. We're recovering from it. All of us are recovering from it. But as I said earlier, I believe it was a complete unnecessary disruptor. A lot of folks have been asking me if I think the next 5 years are going to be anything like the last five. Well, how could they be? For goodness sakes, let's pray that we never get anything like we had to suffer through 2020. Assuming you don't, I think you have to start looking at South Florida from a lens perspective of a new normal. Yeah, our population is growing. We have over 200 Fortune 400 and Fortune 500 companies relocating to South Florida, which is changing the culture, the sophistication, the economics of South Florida for sure. But 90% of you that are watching this presentation, you're not from South Florida. Neither am I. And most of us came here for a bunch of different reasons. Some of us for economic opportunities, some of us for sports and recreation, because let's face it, we have some of the nicest weather in the world. Some of us perhaps for a touch of romance. But either way, we came here for some new beginnings. And I suspect that's how we have to look at South Florida and Miami as we move into the second part of this decade with those fresh eyes that we had when once upon a time we first arrived. So if I may, allow me to quote a famous poet named T.S. Eliot as I close the Q4 Miami report. He wrote a poem called The Gidling. And the first two lines of that poem, I think, are very appropriate for all of us as we approach the second half of the 2020s. It goes as this: we shall not cease from exploration. And the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. Maybe we need to look at Miami the way we once upon did. Miami's different from when any of us arrived here. But those fundamentals of why most people want to come here, I think, are more in place than ever before. I'm wishing every single one of you the best of luck in 2025. We'll be back in April when we offer our 2025 outlook for all of South Florida. This is the recap of 2024. This is the recap of the first half of the decade. Until April, I wish you all so much luck. Bye-bye.